In today's discussion, we're going to compare and contrast two prominent political ideologies that have influenced Western political thought, civic republicanism and classical liberalism. While both emphasize the rule of law and constitutionalism as crucial for a just society, they diverge somewhat in their historical origins, core principles, and perspectives on the roles of individuals in the state. How are they alike and how are they different? And what does it mean for the future of our political systems today? It gets a little fuzzy sometimes on the nuances of these different ideologies. So let's see how these two ideas have developed more or less hand in hand into modern Western political institutions. To begin with, classical liberalism really rests on freedom from two things: private coercion and public coercion. Freedom from private coercion is secured through private property rights, basically meaning you have a right to own things and other people can't just arbitrarily take them away from you. That's sort of the foundation of a free market system, the economic basis for freedom from private coercion. Then you have freedom from public coercion, and this is achieved through limited government, where the government can't just come in and tell you what to do or take your stuff. Basically, there are limits to what the state can do. The idea is to prevent the state from infringing on individual liberties, essentially like drawing a line in the sand, saying this is what the government can and can't do. But there's a tricky third principle in play, which is the state provision of limited public goods. How does that square with this whole idea of limited government? Well, that's where the debate gets really interesting. Most political philosophers who support these concepts argue that a government can provide essential services, things like infrastructure, maybe some sort of social safety net, as long as such policies don't become overly intrusive. But it's a balancing act, and throughout history, different thinkers have had very different ideas about where that line should be drawn. For example, there was a split between the neoclassical liberals and the social liberals that more or less emerged in the 19th century. The neoclassical liberals really clung to that limited government ideal, emphasizing individual responsibility, free markets, very, very limited state intervention. But the social liberals came along and said, well, true equality of opportunity might require a bit more government intervention. They saw that maybe, in some cases, the unfettered free market isn't perfect, and perhaps there needs to be some kind of leveling of the playing field to correct for some of those inequalities or injustices. It's fascinating how that tension between individual liberty and then the need for some level of collective action continues to play out even today. And this is where I think the concept of civic republicanism's non-domination really comes into play. Basically, the non-domination concept goes beyond simply being free from interference. It's about being free from the potential for arbitrary power, whether that power comes from the government, comes from a corporation, or even another individual. It's not just enough to be left alone, but you need to know that no one's just going to suddenly and arbitrarily be able to come in and control or interfere with your life. One example of this concept is that of a slave with a benevolent master. The slave might be treated well, there might not be a lot of actual interference in their day-to-day life, but they're not truly free because the master still holds that power. Their situation could change at any moment, and that potential for that interference is where freedom from domination comes into play. Republicanism is all about building in safeguards against that potential for arbitrary power. Okay, so how does that actually play out in practice? We can look at the American Revolution and the later development of the U.S. Constitution as an example. The Founding Fathers were really deeply influenced by these Republican ideals when it came to building in checks and balances and limited government, as well as their emphasis on civic virtue. Their intent was to prevent any one person or group from accumulating too much power. They believed that republicanism, with this focus on non-domination, provided the best framework for guaranteeing individual liberty. If you've ever wondered about why the U.S. Constitution has features like the three branches of government, Electoral College and Bill of Rights, this all ties back to the non-domination principle. The tumultuous French Revolution, which sent shock waves across Europe and beyond, forced people to rethink the very nature of power and authority and individual rights, how even initially well-intentioned democratic movements can, when unchecked, devolve into violent tyranny. However, while both of these 18th century revolutions had very different outcomes, they were both fueled by this underlying desire for greater liberty and self-determination. As we move into the 19th century, we see these ideas further evolving with the rise of laissez-faire economics, which kind of goes hand in hand with the principle of classical liberalism, freedom from private coercion. Basically, you've got thinkers like Adam Smith and the Manchester School arguing that the best way to maximize freedom and prosperity is just to let individuals pursue their own economic self-interest with minimal government interference, essentially letting the invisible hand of the market do its thing. But as we know, history is never quite that simple, and things got a little more complicated as we saw things like slavery and other racial and ethnic-based biases and oppression occur, as well as the rise of robber barons who took advantage of workers and lack of regulation. While some of these issues were partially addressed during the 19th century, it was in the early 20th century progressive era where we see this kind of shift towards greater government involvement in trying to address all these social and economic problems that had emerged. A major factor in that shift was this growing concern about corruption, such as stock market manipulation and political machines. Progressives saw that this corruption ultimately undermines that whole principle of non-domination by concentrating power in the hands of a few and allowing them to act arbitrarily, undermining the rule of law, fairness, transparency, accountability, all that good stuff. So the progressives, such as Teddy Roosevelt, saw unchecked corporate power and political machines as a direct threat to the public good and individual liberty, so they pushed for reforms to rein them in. That eventually led to the development of what we now think of as social liberalism, which is known for advocating for a more active role for the state in ensuring what supporters think would be a fairer and more just society. When we look over history, it seems like there's a pendulum that swings between emphasizing individual liberty on one hand and then recognizing that sometimes you need some level of collective action to address certain difficult problems. It's not so much about finding one right answer, but in understanding how all these different historical contexts, these competing values have really shaped politics in the U.S. and beyond. In contemporary political discourse, civic republicanism and classical liberalism often overlap and influence each other. Many modern political thinkers draw on elements of both traditions, seeking to balance individual rights with the common good and promote a society that values both individual liberty and civic responsibility. Furthermore, even within a republic that's designed to safeguard against tyranny, we, the people, still have to be vigilant, on our guard about where that power is accumulating. Some frame this as an ongoing debate between those who prioritize national strength and economic growth, even if it means expanding government power, versus those who emphasize individual liberty and limited government, even if it means sacrificing some level of collective efficiency. Others point out that too much power has been concentrated within large corporations and what's called the deep state, resulting in a need to curtail this level of domination. Still others contend that the principle of non-domination can be best achieved by having some members of society give up some of their individual liberty for what they consider the common good. In practice, the debate takes many different forms, and it plays out in countless contemporary issues. For example, take economic regulation. Should the government intervene to try to address income inequality, or should it take a more hands-off approach and trust that the market will sort things out? Another recent example was in the pandemic mandate debate, where you have, on the one hand, this classical liberal emphasis on individual autonomy, the right to make choices about your own body. But then on the other hand, you have this public health argument that sometimes there's need to kind of limit individual choices for the good of the community. Finding the right balance between these competing values is always an ongoing challenge, and it's often informed by our own personal ideologies, peer group, and experiences. But I do think we're facing some real challenges that threaten the very foundation of our combination of civic Republican and liberal democratic principles. The two main threats I see are the growing inequality, which includes a declining middle class, and the increasing influence of special interest groups. Essentially, those two things are distorting the playing field, making it harder for ordinary citizens to really have their voices heard and have their interests represented fairly in the political process. If people feel like they don't have a voice, this can lead them to either become more cynical, withdrawing from the political process, or choose to support populist leaders who they see as supporting their views. If people withdraw from the democratic process, it could lead to a vicious cycle, making problems worse by further concentrating power in the hands of a few. On the other side of the coin, as I discussed in my video on the rise of populism, people might choose to be led by politicians who talk a good game but have their own interests at heart and may end up concentrating power as well. And that's why I think that it's so important to understand these ideologies that form our political society, not just as historical artifacts, but as living frameworks that are still shaping our political discourse and the choices we make. They tap into something fundamental about human nature and how we organize ourselves, the eternal struggle between individual freedom and the need for some sort of collective action as a society as a whole. As you're thinking about all of this, where do you fall on this political spectrum? When you think about classical liberalism, do you lean more towards that minimal state with individual autonomy above all else, or do you think that maybe a more active government is necessary to actually ensure true equality of opportunity, to provide for those who are less fortunate, or to address certain social problems that the market might not be able to solve on its own? I suppose when it comes down to it, it's really about your values and your own understanding of human nature and the role and purpose of government. And so, to wrap up our discussion, here's some final food for thought. How do we balance those principles of individual liberty and limited government with the need to address big problems that we're facing today? Can we really ensure individual liberty in a world where we're constantly being tracked and our data is being collected by government and corporations? In some ways, it's a new set of challenges that the classical liberals of the past didn't necessarily have a plan to deal with. So can we still apply these classic principles to today's problems? Overall, I think we can find solutions, since after all, that's how we've made progress in the past. Most importantly, we have to maintain these core principles of liberty, limited government, and civic virtue. I believe that they will continue to be relevant, and they will continue to guide us as we move forward. What are your thoughts on civic republicanism and classical liberalism? Which appeals to you most, non-domination and the common good, or individual liberty and autonomy? Let me know what you think in the comments. I like to hear from you, no matter if you agree or disagree with me, and like and subscribe to appease those AI overlords. Thanks again for listening to my ramblings.